Sorry. We have been going through the book of Exodus, and we've been talking about Moses, and so far, Moses has been a baby. Now, we're skipping ahead in his life, and Moses is now 40 years old. And there's a big jump to go from, a baby left in a river and talking about the evil that's going on in Egypt and them ordering the death of all males born to the Hebrews. I mean, it's a big jump to go from that baby boy being saved and drawn out of the Nile to now 40 years later. And Moses is 40 years later, and the book of Hebrews tells us this, and it also tells us that Moses is mighty in word and in deed. He has been educated in Pharaoh's own house, and every manner of education he's been coached on, trained and taught, and he's become mighty in word and deed. He is persuasive and can back it up, and he has some wonderful learned skills. Now the scriptures lead us to the idea that Moses knew his heritage. Now sometimes we get confused because we watch movies. And movies might lead us to believe one thing when the scriptures don't actually say that. The movies, it's a great idea that Moses learned later on in life that he was a Hebrew, but the scriptures don't say that. And so most likely, Moses knew his heritage. Most likely, the other people in his family that he grew up in never let him forget that he was a Hebrew. That he wasn't one of them, that he didn't belong, that he was lesser. Most likely, his entire life had been lived this way. But he still had wealth, he still had power, he still had status, but Moses knows who he is. And there's a time coming when Moses cannot help but act. He looks out and he sees what is happening to his people, the people that are like him, his family, his kindred, the people that are his people. And he can't help but act. In our scripture that Sarah read this morning, Moses murders the Egyptian slave master and hides his body. This is what Moses does. I want to make a point that I feel is at the heart of this story. God often gives us the heart before He gives us the plan. God gives us the heart before He gives us the plan. God places things on our heart before He provides the opportunities for them to fully take flight. He puts things on and He says, you know what, you're going to be compassionate and caring about this long before I bring it to fruition, long before my plan comes around. You're going to care about this and be passionate about this. I'm going to place this in you. And we see that in Moses. Moses had compassion for his people, and it hurt him that they were in slavery. It hurt him that they were being forced and that these wicked things were happening to his people. It hurt him. God puts things on us. And God had given Moses a heart for the hurting and oppressed Hebrew slaves long before God had given Moses a plan. So Moses, with all of his wealth and power and social status, chooses the Hebrews over Pharaoh's house. It's a tough choice. That has got to be one of the tough ones. And it's one thing that we have to honor Moses for. Is the fact that he had the choice between power and comfort and position and fame or righteousness. What he thought was right, what he believed was right. Power, comfort, and position, fame, wealth, all of that over what he thinks is right. Could you do it? Could you give up power and comfort and position and fame and wealth because you thought something else was right? I don't know if I could. I know me, and so I'd probably start thinking to myself, I can do more for him if I stay here in Pharaoh's house. Start convincing myself, I'll have more I can do more good for them if I stay here in wealth and comfort and power. And we usually try and convince ourselves of these things. Moses has to be commended. He has to be commended. He had it all. He had it all. And he could have said, I will do the most value here. But he didn't. Hebrews 11:24 and 25 say this. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing to be mistreated with the people of God rather than enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He chose to be a Hebrew instead of one of Pharaoh's in his house. Can you imagine? Can you imagine the choice? He didn't stay in the machine for the good of the Hebrews. He turned his back on wealth and influence and comfort. He turned his back on all those wonderful things that everybody wants. And instead, he chose to be a Hebrew. And he chose the hard way. Moses chooses this. Moses is a stellar man, and one that we cannot help but look at and say, I don't know if I could have made that choice. And every one of us have to be honest with ourselves. Could we make that choice to pick what was right over all those comforts, over all those good things? But Moses did. And it reminds us of this theme that we've been talking about in the book of Exodus, and that is that God is in the background. So far, God has not come to the forefront. He hasn't had a conversation with Moses, nothing like that. But God is pulling strings in the background. He's bringing things together, and it's starting to move. Everything we've watched God do to this point is in the background. He's moving pieces. He hasn't talked to Moses. He hasn't come to him in a dream or anything. Yet Moses, in all of his learning and all of his courage and all of his compassion, he understands, I'm the one that's supposed to help my people. You get that? Before Moses had a calling from God, he knew it. He knew that he was going to be the one. He knew that he had to do something, that he had to help his people. And so I remind you, God often brings you the heart. He often brings you the calling before he brings you the means and the way to do it. He puts that on your heart the way he did Moses. Moses knew. This is 40 years before God's going to come to him. Okay, it's going to be another 40 years before God's going to come to him in a burning bush. But Moses knew now, I'm supposed to do something about slavery. I'm supposed to do something about my people and the oppression that they are seeing. And so Moses, he decides to act. He decides to act. In all of his courage and all of his compassion, he says, I'm going to help my people. And he decides to take matters into his own hands, and he launches the dumbest attempt at freeing people in the entire history of the world. I don't know how he thought that this was going to save his people. I'm going to kill that Egyptian slave driver, and that's going to help my people. I don't know how he thought that this was going to solve anything, but in his mind he knew he had to do something, and so he wanted to act. And so he chose to kill this man. What's it going to accomplish? What's this going to do? Not only does he murder this man, but he knows he shouldn't murder this man. You know how he knows he shouldn't murder this man? It says he looked around and made sure no one was watching. You don't look around and make sure no one's watching when you're about to do something good. Okay, that's not what you do. But Moses is looking around, make sure nobody sees what he's about to do. And this is when he kills the Egyptian slave driver. Second point for us this morning. When we get ahead of God, we invite disaster. When we get ahead of God, we invite disaster. Nothing good ever comes from trying to do it on our own, trying to do it without God, trying to get ahead of His plans and what He has revealed. When we try and take it on ourselves, we invite disaster. We see this over and over again. Nothing good ever comes from trying to do it without God. Especially when we're talking about passions that God Himself has given us. It never works out to try and rush God's plans for our lives. And here's how I know it. Over and over again in the Bible, when you see somebody try and rush God's plans, it blows up. It never works out good for them. Abraham, he has promised a son. We've talked about this recently. Abraham's promised a son. And that son's going to become a mighty nation. Abraham's an old man. And it's getting older all the time. And God, where's the son? God promised the son, where is my son? And finally Sarah says to him, why don't you take my handmaid? Have a son with her. She's not 90 years old. Maybe she can give you a son. And so Abraham decides, God gave this to me. God gave me this promise. I'm going to take it into my own hands. I'm going to accomplish it. I'm going to see it done. And so he takes her handmaid and he has a son with her. That son's name is Ishmael. The world still feels the ripples of this mistake. Abraham's son Ishmael is the father of a great nation. The Muslim people look to him as their father. If only Abraham hadn't tried to do it without God and just waited for his son Isaac and waited for the way that God had planned. There's a time where King Saul is ready to go to war, and he's ready to go to war, but the man of God has not come yet to offer the sacrifice. And Saul gets impatient, and he says, we can't go to war until we offer the sacrifice. And so Saul offers the sacrifice himself. And that was the end of Saul being king. Well, that was the end of Saul being king because he rushed it. He tried to do it himself instead of waiting for what God had planned. Jonah too, he's a man who runs ahead of God. He ran away from God first, but eventually God got him to Nineveh and got him to preach to the people. But Jonah got ahead of God. Jonah had preached to the people that God was going to smite them because they had been evil. And so Jonah went up and found a place on a hill, nice shady spot where he could watch God destroy the city of hundreds of thousands of people. God came to him and they repented. I'm going to forgive them. And Jonah was so upset. He wanted to die. It was terrible to him because he had gotten ahead of God. We cannot get ahead of God. Moses has the right heart. He has the right heart, the heart of compassion given him by God. But look at the plan, look at his plan compared to God's plan. I mean, let's set the two side by side for a moment here. We haven't seen God's plan yet, but we know it. Moses, hoping to be seen here as a liberator of the Hebrews, kills a slave driver. What's the end game? I mean, maybe somebody didn't get whipped today who would have. I mean, that's the best case scenario, but chances are a lot of people are going to pay for it tomorrow. It's not going to be good. What's his hope? Maybe I can sneak around and kill all the slave drivers one day at a time. I'll just sneak around and do this and be this covert op and try and free my people like this. I mean, what is his plan compared to God's? When God finally talks to him, hey Moses, I got plans. I know you acted on the spur of the moment. You killed a man. Moses, I got plans. I'm going to turn the Nile to blood. I've got 10 plagues. I've got miracles. Your staff is going to turn into a snake, and you're going to be able to show them leprosy that when you put it in your cloak goes away, and it's going to be amazing what I am going to do, and every Hebrew is going to walk out of Egypt. Every one of them. We're not leaving anybody behind. What is Moses' plan compared to God's? And yet, all too often, I think that that's our plans compared to God's. We have a passion for something, but we have no idea how much bigger God's plans are for us because we're too concerned about our plans and doing it our way. When the whole time God's like, you're doing it so small. Don't you know I have bigger plans? I'm going to send plagues. I'm going to make the world sit back in awe at what I'm going to do. It's amazing. It's amazing. Moses has the right heart. He has the heart for his people, but it's not time yet. And so still he kills the Egyptian. Now what does this taking matters into your own hands accomplish? Not only has Pharaoh decided that Pharaoh wants to kill him, he's also incited his Hebrew brothers against him. The next day he goes out and he sees two Hebrews fighting. Hebrew on Hebrew crime. And he says, why would you strike your brother? He has decided that he is going to be their leader. I mean, that's at his heart. He's like, I'm standing up for you guys, and here you are fighting against each other. And he's telling them, we got to be better than this. He's ready to be their leader. He wants to be their leader. Why do you strike your brother? Why would you do that? And what does the Hebrew respond to him? Who has made you prince or judge over us? God hasn't yet. God hasn't put him in that place. Moses has put himself in that place. And we can try and say, well, God's going to eventually... He hasn't done it yet. Moses has put himself in that place. And he's not ready for it. The people reject him. Are you going to kill us like you killed that Egyptian too? People say, you're not our leader. You're not the one who's supposed to lead us. Moses had two people. He had Pharaoh's household. He was an Egyptian. And he was also a Hebrew. He had two households. And now, through one act of rebellion, through one act of taking everything into his own hands, now he has none. The Hebrews don't want him. You're not our leader. And Pharaoh wants to kill him. And so Moses must flee. And he flees to the wilderness. Our third point, the wilderness isn't a bad place to be. The wilderness isn't a bad place to be. Some of you today, you understand what the wilderness is like. Life isn't good in the wilderness. It's not comfortable in the wilderness. It's hard. You're lonely. You're struggling. And maybe like Moses, you're running from something. And you find yourself at a spot in life where you understand what wilderness living is like. Because you're going through a very hard time, a difficult time. And it is just a tough moment in your life. And you say, I relate to the wilderness. The wilderness is not a fun place to be. But the wilderness in the Scriptures is a place where the people meet their God. Over and over again. Wilderness in the Scriptures is where people meet their God. The wilderness is where Jacob sees the stairway to heaven. In Genesis 28, the wilderness, in 1 Kings 19, is where Elijah hears the still small voice of God. In the New Testament, it's where John the Baptist preaches repentance. And it's in the wilderness where Saul of Tarsus wrestles with the Old Testament Scriptures to find Christ. It's in the wilderness that Jesus goes off to draw close to his God. Over and over again, the wilderness is this place where we connect with our God, where we have drawn away from the things of this world so that we can connect with the God who made us. It's in the wilderness where this is the shift from he makes the rules, he's the boss, he tells me what to do, to he loves me. He's for me. And I love him back. It's a tough thing because most of us, when we view the wilderness and the tough times in life, we say, God, I don't want to go through that. But it's in those tough times where we really draw close to God. It's in those tough times where he calls us and reveals to us what his whole plans are for us. It's in the wilderness, not in Egypt. It's not when you're sitting at Pharaoh's table. It's when you're in the wilderness. Even if we look back at this text, you have the prince of Egypt who probably hasn't had to do a lot for himself. And here he finds himself in the wilderness. What's he going to eat? Where's he going to sleep? What happens next? What happens? And by the grace of God, jumping ahead, he finds a home. He gets married. He has a son. And the wilderness is kind to him. God speaks to him in the wilderness. And perhaps Moses' biggest struggle was that in his passion for God's people and in his impatience for God to give a plan, Moses took things into his own hands and tried to be God. And I think that's what we struggle with too. We might have a good passion. God has placed something on our hearts that we want to do. And we just oftentimes are so impatient that we decide, I know best. I'll figure this out. And when we do that, we try to be God. We try to be God. I wonder this morning, what areas of your life are you operating like that in? What areas of life are you trying to be God? If that's too difficult of a question, here's some pointer questions that might help you understand what areas you're trying to be God in. What do you get most anxious about or most angry about? What makes you the most anxious? What worries you and makes you fret and not sleep at night? What angers you and makes it so that you just can't let go? Point to those areas and I think you'll have an idea of where you're trying to be God. Where you're trying to hold on to all control. Where is it that you're trying to be God? Where is it that you just can't seem to trust Him? Are you Moses and God has given you the heart to bring change, but He hasn't given you the plan yet, and so you're struggling and wanting to just act even if you know it's wrong? Maybe you've been acting. And however, with no want or regard for what God wants to do in your life, you haven't waited, you haven't prayed, you haven't sought Him. Good news for you. God still used Moses. And if you will turn to Him, God will use you too. He still has plans for your life, and I promise you, they're bigger than the plans you have made. They're bigger than the things that you thought you could do. He has bigger plans. May you find yourself in a rough patch this morning, and you know what the wilderness is like. And if you're in the wilderness right now, don't despise it. Cherish the time, because this is a time where you draw close to God. If you're in the rough patch right now, this is the time where you cling to Him. This is the time where people find their God and connect with Him like no other time. Don't despise the wilderness. The Lord is there. You don't have to feel abandoned. In fact, He does some of His most beautiful work in those spaces. You'll find out when you're trying to come to the other side, I promise. Where are you trying to be God and not trusting Him? So the praise team comes up this morning. We're called to give Him our trust. Where do you need to wait? Where do you need to seek Him out? We all have ways where we have sought to be our own God, where we've sought to be in control. Where is it that you need to turn over to Him this morning?